Are going to try this again. Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Dragon's Dungeon Talk. This is Robert Scribbler, and I will be sharing with you a homebrew creation or a recreating of the classic Dual Wielder feat for you today. And why are we doing this? Well, this is a very popular way of fighting in Dungeons and Dragons combat, particularly for your martial types, your fighters, and your rangers to wield a weapon in each hand. But mechanically speaking, the use of this feat and this weapon combination is not necessarily the best choice for optimization. Optimization tends to lean more towards your great swords and your Polearm Master types. And with this homebrew option, we're going to try and balance things out for you. We're not going to create a homebrew feat that causes two weapon fighting to dominate, but we're going to make one that brings you closer into line with the Great Weapon Master types and your Polearm Master types. So why are we doing this discussion? Why does dual wielding have such a draw? And mechanically speaking, dual wielding was the dominant or one of the dominant ways to optimize your characters in second edition Dungeons and Dragons. And this created whole new versions of heroes, this understanding of optimization. And there were heroes in fiction, I believe, many of them that were inspired by this optimization. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later. Uh, Such to the point that dual wielding became a fixation in the mind of players that wanted to emulate the heroes that they loved. Now, in other editions, 3.5, for example, and 5e, the optimization focus shifted more toward great weapon fighting, and in 5e particularly, it shifted more toward great weapon fighting and polearm fighting, which seems to dominate. And why is this the case? Well, one, the rules in 5e, the feats particularly in 5e, are superior for Great Weapon Master. The Great Weapon Master feat is superior to many of the other feats, mechanically speaking, and the Polearm Master feat is similarly superior. Now, this is my first of a series of video blogs on the issue of feat modifications, homebrew feat modifications for 5e. But I thought we would start out with Dual Wielder because I believe this particular feat deserves some more love. And why does it? Why does it? We spoke a little bit about some of the character and player love for dual wielders early on. And why is this? Well, in large part, it's due to this one famous dual wielder, Drizzt, who has inspired players across the D&D multiverse to dual wield throughout the game. And then I've seen many people try to emulate Drizzt and or just be a powerful dual wielder, just simply because of the inspiration that came from reading the Drizzt books, or even inspiration from other characters in fiction. One of them being Fate's archer character, who is also a dual wielder, uses a bow and two weapons with equally powerful proficiency. And another rather popular anime has also popularized dual wielding, that being Sword Art Online, in which Kirito uses two long swords to great effect throughout the first two seasons. So Dual Wielder is very popular in fiction, and this leads people to want to play characters that emulate those heroes from fiction, from various sources in games. And And it can be a little bit disappointing when you run into the Dungeons and Dragons dual wielder feat and you don't really get the same bang for your buck that you see in these wonderful tales that we have grown to love. So going back to our slides, what makes Drizzt and and other dual wielders like Drizzt so badass if they use the rules from second edition Dungeons and Dragons? And we have to look back at the Ranger class, particularly, although fighter mages could effectively dual wield as well. And I saw a number of these back in the day when I was playing second edition Dungeons and Dragons. But you got to look closely at the Ranger because the Ranger was really well set up to optimize dual wielding in second edition Dungeons and Dragons. For one, the Ranger allowed no penalties on two weapon fighting while wearing light armor, so studded leather or leather armor. And regular players suffered a -2 or a penalty to the attacks with their main hand while dual wielding, and a -4 penalty with their offhand. Now, they could take other types of weapon fighting specializations to reduce those penalties, but it took time. And a ranger could just start right out the gate without these penalties while they were wearing light armor. The second part was that if you use your proficiency slots to specialize in a weapon, it grants you a +1 to hit and a +2 on damage for each of your attacks. So, for example, if you are going to emulate Drizzt and you take weapon specialization in Scimitar and wield a scimitar in each hand, you get that bonus with both of these weapons that you're wielding. You've got your main hand weapon and your offhand weapon, and both of which get this amazing bonus to hit and to damage, again, increasing your damage. And then the last thing is that when you take these specializations and Ranger, at first level, you have a combined 5 attacks every 2 rounds, which immediately out the gate turns you into a Cuisinart of danger to your enemies. And so this is the mechanics that really made a character like Drizzt possible. And I would argue that the optimization in this case, in second edition Dungeons and Dragons in the way back machine, inspired Drizzt. I would argue that R.A. Salvatore, who played Dungeons and Dragons, really came to enjoy his Drizzt character, at least in part, due to the fact that he was able to create this signature style of fighting through use of a second edition optimization. Of course, there's a lot more to Drizzt than just the optimization, but what would Drizzt be without his dual scimitars? I mean, there'd definitely be something essential missing, I would argue. So, if we want to do something like this in Dungeons and Dragons 5e, what will we do? What changes would we make to the dual wielder feat as a homebrew if we wanted to give some love back to players that wanted to play dual wielders? And I've given this a big think. Treant, Monk, and others have also given this a big think. And this is my version of it. I also invite you to take a look at Treant Monk's own example. Oops, sorry, wrong slide. And so this is my shot at the dual wielder homebrew feat for D&D 5e. And these are my changes. So I'm keeping the initial, you gain a +1 bonus to armor class for the first feature of the dual wielder feat for 5e, but I'm adding the second part. And the second part is, and you also gain a +2 bonus to damage when you are wielding a separate weapon in each hand. So already right out the gate, we get a bonus to our defense and our offense. We're not completely making up for our loss of the shield, but we do get a nice little bonus to our AC here. And we also get a little boost to our damage, which helps our damage per round. Now, for the second part, I've also kept the first feature. You can use two-weapon fighting even when your one-handed weapons aren't light. But I added a new feature, and I think this is also very fun and very punchy. It adds a little bit of sting to our dual wielder feat. The second feature that I'm adding is when you score a critical hit while two-weapon fighting, you make you may make two bonus action attacks with your offhand weapon instead of one. So basically, you get something equivalent to a monk's flurry of blows, but when you score a critical hit, and this gives you a chance to explode while dual wielding just a little bit by getting these extra attacks. I mean, we're not getting a plus 10 bonus to our damage rolls like the Great Weapon Fighter, but it does give us the option to make more attacks, which can be pretty optimal in a lot of situations. So so we get some more damage, and we also like steady damage, and we get some more explosive damage. And then the last feature I just keep, you can draw or stow two one-handed weapons when you would normally only be able to draw one. So is this something that we can use to emulate a Drizzt type character? I'm not too sure. I think in general, this feat gives, I would say, fighters and blade singers, for example, a lot more bang for their buck given certain combinations. I do think that you can use it much more effectively with a ranger, although it does still compete with some of your cool bonus action spells like Hunter's Mark, for example. But it does go a long way to making you more effective as a dual wielder, even as a ranger. And if you were relying more on your dexterity, for example, in combat, and you want to dual wield, say, rapiers or scimitars, this does give you a good option for switch hitting. You can use your bow, and then, for close combat, you can pull out your two rapiers or your two scimitars and just go at it, right? Now, as far as your spell options, I think if you were a ranger, you would, and you're relying on dual wielder in melee combat, I think you would tend to rely less on spells like Hunter's Mark that also require a bonus action because you're going to be crit fishing to get those two bonus action attacks on your critical hits. Um, so you might want to look at other spells like Zephyr Strike, which gives you a continuous effect of not provoking attacks of opportunity, so adding to your mobility, which might also help you deal some more damage. And then later on, maybe Elemental Weapon for maybe your main hand weapon if you don't have a second magic weapon, for example. So here is my little patch, my little homebrew patch for the dual wielder feat. And this is my first video blog in a series. For my next video blog, I'm going to look at a patch for the Great Weapon Master feat. And we're just going to do a little tweak to the Great Weapon Master feat to add to the variety of weapons that you can use with the Great Weapon Master feat. And the overall goal of this series is to provide some homebrew options that expand the scope of the kinds of weapons that we can use and optimize in Dungeons and Dragons 5e, but without breaking the mechanic, without providing options that are superior to the Great Weapon Master and the Polearm, but instead just providing some options that get us closer to the Great Weapon Master and the Polearm in our optimization scale, and that may in some cases equal what a Great Weapon Master can do. Now, I'm not too sure if this dual wielder homebrew feat gets quite to that mark, but I decided to be a little bit, err on the side of caution But I can think of some combinations in some classes where this might really, really work well. So I spoke, about, its use with fighter and blade singer, kind of obvious choices. But I mean, the swords bard might do really well with this, particularly if they take a spell like, oh man, what is that spell? I have your brain cramp. Spirit Shroud at level 10 for their magical secrets. And now you're adding that extra Spirit Shroud damage over time. Of course, it's a bonus action to cast, but once you cast it, you have it for a whole combat. So for a long combat, Spirit Shroud might be extraordinarily effective in combination with this feat. Another spell that might be extraordinarily effective for Gish would be Tensor's Transformation in combination with this feat, and possibly even Elven Accuracy might be a really vicious combo. And interestingly enough, I think that this feat might actually be an interesting backdoor for a paladin that might take some other feats to try and focus on dual wielding. So I don't know. Maybe at some point I will do a homebrew Gish optimized mini blog on this issue. So, but just to get the creative juices flowing, if you use this dual wielder homebrew version in your games and have some feedback for me, please go ahead and contact me either on my blog over at scribblersfantasticalworkshop.com or on my YouTube page and just in the comments. And I'll do my best to interact with you and hear your thoughts. Or you can also drop a line with me to me on Twitch, and I'll do my best to reply in the comments. So thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy this first weapon version of a homebrew feat for D&D 5e for our next dragons dungeon talk. We'll be exploring some expanded options for the great weapon master feat. So thank you so much for joining me, and I will be